On March 8th in the year 1944, at 14,000 feet above Brunswick, the German pilot Wilhelm Hoffmann watched the approaching American fighter through his gun sight and felt a mix of disbelief and irritation as the huge machine filled his view like a rolling steel barrel. Sky, and he wondered again how such a thing could even fly, because to him, and to every other Luftwaffe pilot, it looked far too bulky and far too heavy to be a real fighter, and they had mocked it for months in their mess halls, calling it the Jug and the Flying Bathtub and the 7-ton milk bottle. But none of that mocking mattered now as Hoffmann squeezed his trigger and felt his cannon shake the frame of his Bf-109, while bright sparks flashed across the thick American skin, and yet the strange heavy fighter refused to break apart, and instead rolled smoothly inverted before dropping into a dive so fast it seemed to tear the air open, and Hoffmann pushed his stick forward to follow as the needle on his airspeed gauge climbed past 350, then 400, then 450, and still rising, and his thin German machine began to tremble as if begging him to stop, while the controls turned stiff and heavy in his hands, and by the time he reached 470 miles per hour, he felt the frame complaining, and he knew that pushing any further would rip his wings free, so he eased back helplessly, while the American machine disappeared into the clouds. Gaining speed beyond 500 miles per hour like it was not resisting the dive, but embracing it because it had been built for that exact moment. And Hoffmann realized with cold clarity that all the jokes had hidden a truth none of them had wanted to face, and that the sheer mass of the American fighter was not a flaw at all, but a weapon by itself, and that Alexander Kartveli, the immigrant engineer who designed it, had shaped a monster that obeyed a different set of rules from anything the Germans flew. Months earlier, Major Hans Philipp, the respected commander of JG-1, had been briefed on the same American fighter, and he remembered how he had laughed aloud at the reconnaissance photographs laid before him, and had pointed at the giant machine while asking his officers how such a beast could even leave the ground because it looked twice the size of a Spitfire, and weighed more than 13,000 pounds loaded, and needed a 2,000 horsepower engine merely to keep itself aloft, and to Philip with his 206 victories. This was not the shape of a fighter at all, but the shape of a mistake. When the P-47 arrived in England with the 56th Fighter Group in January of 1943, the British pilots stared at it in disbelief, and even the Americans trained on lighter Spitfires felt uneasy because climbing into that cockpit felt like climbing into a giant metal tower, and the airfield itself shook whenever the massive 18-cylinder engine started, and the Pratt & Whitney R2800 was not only huge, but the most powerful engine produced at scale in the world, with 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows, and early models already pushing 2,000 horsepower and later ones even more, and each cylinder was the size of a small container, and the whole power plant weighed over 2,300 pounds. And German engineers refused to believe the Americans could mass-produce something that complicated, and yet by late 1943, the Republic factory was turning out 20 P-47s per day, while German plants scattered across their shrinking territory managed perhaps 15 Bf-109s in total across all facilities. All this time the Luftwaffe kept laughing at the American design, while German pilots like Hinz Koch wrote in their diaries about their first encounters in April of 1943, near Wilhelmshaven, where they saw the enormous shapes of the American fighters glinting miles away, and assumed they would be easy prey because they seemed to fly straight and level like bombers without fancy weaving or tight maneuvers, and every German pilot prepared to swoop down in their classic fast dive from high altitude, a tactic that had worked for years against Spitfire's Hurricanes and Soviet fighters, as they would build speed drop through the enemy formation and zoom back up to safety. But when the Bf-109s dropped toward the P-47s, that spring something impossible happened because the American fighters simply pushed their noses down in response and accelerated away at speeds the Germans could not match, and pilots who had trusted their dive advantage for their entire careers found their airspeed indicators shaking near 480 miles per hour, while the American fighters pulled far ahead, perhaps past 520 or 540 miles per hour, and vanished in the distance as if the Germans had never even begun chasing them. All the jokes about size and weight meant nothing in those moments because that huge weight turned into terrifying velocity once pointed downward. And Alexander Kartveli had built the P-47 around exactly two ideas that would define high-altitude escort combat. And the first was raw power to reach the bombers at their operating altitudes, and the second was mass to break away from danger in a dive that no enemy could follow. Every pound of that 7-ton frame had a purpose, from the oversized engine to the massive turbo supercharger to the heavy armor plates to the 8 machine guns locked into its wings, and all of it added up to a machine designed for a sky where German fighters struggled to breathe. The proof came brutally on June 26th in the year 1943, when Lieutenant Robert Johnson, flying over France, found himself alone against the ace Egon Meyer, who fired again and again until Johnson's Thunderbolt was torn open with more than 200 holes and a shattered canopy and ruined gauges, yet somehow still flying. And when Johnson found his canopy jammed and could not bail out, Meyer approached to finish him. But even after hundreds more rounds, the heavy American fighter refused to fall, and Meyer finally saluted in disbelief and broke away while Johnson coaxed the wounded giant home across the channel, where mechanics later counted 252 holes in the skin and still restored the fighter to flying condition within weeks. That was when the Luftwaffe began to learn the truth of the machine they had mocked. The German pilots, slowly realizing that the heavy American fighter they had joked about was something far different from what they had believed, and that its strength was not an accident, but a design crafted for a new kind of war that was arriving whether they liked it or not. Hintz Koch, serving with JG-11, described that first clash with the American fighters as a strange moment, because the entire German squadron approached with confidence, expecting an easy victory, since the P-47s looked enormous and slow, and they seemed to fly in straight, predictable lines. Without the twisting maneuvers Soviet fighters used, and without the elegant curves of British Spitfires, and the German pilots believed their old tactic would work once again, which was to dive from 23,000 feet with the sun behind them, and let gravity build their speed and cut through the enemy formation before climbing back up to safety, and it had worked flawlessly for 4 years. But the feast they expected never came, because when they dropped on the Americans that April, the P-47s simply dipped their noses down and began accelerating away with a speed that made no sense. And Koch wrote later that he saw his own airspeed needle pass 480 miles per hour with the frame shaking so hard he feared the wings would snap, yet the American fighters kept diving faster, as if they were built for exactly that escape, and they vanished in the distance, leaving the Germans stunned, because they had discovered that the mass they mocked had become power. The deeper the dive went, and none of their aircraft could match it. The secret rested in the design Alexander Kartveli had imagined years before, when he realized that escorting bombers at 25,000 to 30,000 feet required both immense power and tremendous durability, and so he built the P-47 around the huge turbo supercharged engine that delivered sea-level power at heights where German fighters gasped for air, and he encased the cockpit in heavy armor and anchored 8 machine guns in the wings, and then he balanced all that weight with a wing area large enough to keep the aircraft controllable at heights where the air grew thin, and the German designers who had focused on light fast interceptors simply did not believe such a machine could work. The durability of the P-47 was proven again on that June day, when Lieutenant Robert Johnson barely survived the attack from Egon Meyer, and the story of those 200 holes became famous across both sides, and German officers studied the reports with disbelief, because no fighter they built could have taken such punishment and flown home. The Germans knew dogfighting well, and they understood that their Bf-109 was optimized for battles below 15,000 feet, and that its supercharger delivered maximum power at around 16,000 feet, and that above 20,000 feet it struggled badly, and the pilots felt engines wheeze as if trying to breathe in thin air. And when they chased P-47s high above the clouds, they realized that the American engines were roaring with full strength thanks to the turbo superchargers that spun at 20,000 revolutions per minute, driven by exhaust gases that Germans had dismissed as an impossible concept to build at scale. At 25,000 feet, the P-47 often had more power than the Bf-109 did at sea level, and at 30,000 feet, the difference was so great that the American fighters could turn faster, climb stronger, and accelerate harder, while the German engines became weak and unresponsive. General Adolf Galland received reports on the P-47 in May of 1943, and after reading the technical assessments, he approved tactics that were meant to exploit what German analysts assumed were weaknesses, and those analysts insisted the American fighter was too heavy to turn well, and that its large size must mean a huge turning radius, so they recommended engaging the Americans in horizontal turns where agility mattered, and this advice proved disastrously wrong because Republic test pilot Lowry Brabham had discovered that the large wings of the P-47 gave it far better turning ability than expected, especially at high altitudes where the German fighters were starving for power. Captain Fred Christensen proved this in July of 1943 over Holland, when his squadron met JG-26, and the Germans dove with confidence, expecting the heavy American fighters to be sitting targets. But Christensen waited until the Bf-109s committed, then pulled his stick back and felt the big Pratt & Whitney engine deliver power with ease at 24,000 feet, and his P-47 held a 6G turn that surprised even him, and the German fighter that tried to follow simply stalled because its engine no longer had enough strength to maintain the maneuver, and Christensen rolled behind it and fired a burst from his 8 machine guns, ending the fight in 3 seconds. Those 8 machine guns were another detail the Germans had ridiculed because they believed no serious fighter should lack a cannon, but they misunderstood the American approach because the .50 caliber Browning was no mere rifle round, and each bullet was the size of a thumb and flew at tremendous speed, and 8 guns together delivered 100 rounds per second, and each P-47 carried 3,400 rounds, meaning it had 40 seconds of continuous fire, which was enormous compared to German fighters that often carried only 60 seconds of total ammunition, and sometimes less. When Hans Rosbach examined a crashed P-47 in August of 1943, he was shocked by how many rounds the Americans carried, and he wrote that German pilots needed to make every shot count, while Americans could miss 20 times and still have ample ammunition left. Meanwhile, Republic Aviation began producing P-47s at a pace that defied German comprehension, and by October of 1943, the factory produced 460 fighters per month, with the assembly line running day and night as 7,000 workers labored across 2 and 500,000 square feet, and every 63 minutes another complete fighter rolled out, while German factories struggled to build a fraction of that number. Oberst Joseph Priller saw the reality firsthand when he visited a forward airfield in November of 1943 and counted only 18 Bf-109s and 12 FW-190 aircraft available, while American forces launched 300 fighters at a time, and when he asked Berlin for reinforcements, he received empty promises, and soon the mathematics of war showed their sharp teeth as Operation Argument, known to the Americans as Big Week, began in January of 1944, and for 6 days, thousands of bombers struck German aircraft factories while hundreds of P-47s escorted them, and the Luftwaffe rose to defend because they had no choice. And in those 6 days, they lost 355 pilots, while the Americans lost only 28 P-47 pilots. And pilots, not machines, were the critical loss because Germany could not replace them. Franz Stigler wrote that during Big Week, they could neither climb to the altitude of the P-47s, nor match their dives, nor outrun them above 20,000 feet. And all they could do was dive for the deck and pray, but the Americans followed them down. The Luftwaffe, finally understanding that the battles they once controlled were slipping away because the sky now belonged to the heavy American fighters that refused to be caught and refused to be destroyed. Captain Fred Christensen, flying with the 56th Fighter Group, proved the true nature of the P-47 on July 7th, in the year 1943, when his squadron met the elite German unit JG-26 over Holland, and the Germans came in with confidence, believing they would tear apart the heavy American fighters because they had always relied on the same pattern of attack by diving from above, slashing through, and climbing back to safety. Yet on that day, the sky betrayed them because Christensen waited until the moment the Bf-109s committed to their dive. Then he pulled back on his stick, and the huge Pratt & Whitney engine roared with full strength at 24,000 feet. And the big American machine answered with a 6G turn. And the surprising part was that it kept turning without complaint, while the German pilot behind him tried to follow, stalled out, and dropped away because his engine no longer had the power to hold the maneuver, and Christensen smoothly rolled behind him and fired a burst from his 8 guns, ending the fight instantly with a precision stroke that stunned every witness. Those 850 caliber Browning guns soon became a nightmare for German pilots because they had not understood what they were facing, and they had mocked the idea of a fighter without cannon, believing that rifle caliber weapons could not win air battles. Yet they had underestimated American industry, and they had misunderstood the scale of the ammunition carried by the P-47, because the 50 caliber round was nothing like a rifle bullet, and each slug was the size of a man's thumb fired at tremendous speed. And when 8 guns fired together, they unleashed 100 rounds per second, and each P-47 carried 3,400 rounds, giving the pilot 40 seconds of continuous fire, which was unheard of for any European fighter. In August of 1943, Hans Rossbach, an armorer studying a downed P-47, realized the scale of the threat, and he wrote that their own Bf-109s carried roughly 120 cannon rounds, and often only 60 seconds of total ammunition, while the American fighter could afford to miss many times and still keep firing. And that difference in ammunition was yet another expression of the American advantage in industrial warfare. This industrial power became even clearer as Republic Aviation increased production through the year 1943, and by October the factory was creating 460 P-47s per month, and the Farmingdale plant stretched over 2.5 million square feet and ran non-stop, with 7,000 workers across 3 shifts, and every 63 minutes, a finished 7-ton fighter rolled out, while German factories struggled under shortages, bombings, and scattered resources, and together across all facilities, Germany produced barely 350 fighters monthly across every type. Oberst Joseph Priller understood the crisis when he visited a forward airfield in November and counted only 18 Bf-109s and 12 FW-190s ready for duty, while the Americans routinely launched 300 fighters in a single sweep. And every time he asked Berlin for reinforcements, they told him the same empty promise that help was coming next month. But the numbers kept shrinking, and the sky kept filling with American fighters. All of this came to a violent climax during Operation Argument, known as Big Week, beginning in February of 1944, when American bomber forces launched massive raids for 6 straight days against German aircraft production sites, and P-47s flew escort at altitudes the Luftwaffe could barely reach, and the Germans were forced into the air because if they did not fight, their factories would die. And in those 6 days, the Luftwaffe lost 355 pilots, not aircraft, but pilots, the irreplaceable core of German air power, while the Americans lost only 28 P-47 pilots, and the loss of those experienced German men meant far more than the destruction of any machine. Franz Stigler, who flew with JG-27, said later that during Big Week, he and his comrades faced an enemy they could not challenge because the P-47s attacked from 30,000 feet using an altitude the Luftwaffe could not achieve, and when the Germans tried to climb, they lost power, and when they tried to retreat in dives, the Americans followed them effortlessly, reaching speeds that would break German wings, and the German pilots found themselves forced again and again to dive for the ground in desperation, hoping the P-47s would not chase, but they always did. It was during this time that American pilots discovered something the Germans completely failed to anticipate, which was that the heavy P-47, with its massive construction and reinforced airframe, could survive pull-out forces above 9 GS, allowing pilots to recover from dives at speeds that would tear a Bf-109 apart, since German fighters built for nimble, low-altitude combat often began losing wings at 7 GS, especially during high-speed recoveries when the airframe could not take the strain, and in those moments the hunters became the hunted. Colonel Hubert Zemck, commander of the 56th Fighter Group, understood this new reality, and he reshaped their tactics not to fight like Spitfire pilots, but to use altitude, speed, and firepower as their main weapons, and he turned the P-47 into a true boom and zoom predator, diving from 30,000 feet with enormous power, firing a brief devastating burst, then climbing back to the heights where no German fighter could follow. And he told his men to let the Luftwaffe dance at 15,000 feet, because from 20,000 upward, the P-47 owned the sky. The results confirmed his vision, as the 56th Fighter Group became the highest-scoring American fighter group in the European theater, with 674 aerial victories, and only 128 aircraft lost in air-to-air combat, and the ratio of 5-to-1 became a symbol of the Thunderbolt's dominance, and individual pilots like Francis Gabreski with 28 victories, Robert Johnson with 27, Hubert Zemck with 17.75, and Fred Christensen with 21.5 became names the Germans learned to fear, and the results were always confirmed by gun camera, footage and wreckage on the ground, proving the effectiveness of the heavy American fighter. The Luftwaffe beginning to realize that they were no longer facing a single aircraft design, but the full momentum of an industrial giant, and that the P-47 had shifted the balance of aerial combat at high altitudes, turning every fight into a test of strength, power, and endurance that German fighters were never designed to win. By the early months of 1944, the P-47 had become a weapon the Luftwaffe could neither outrun nor overpower, and the American pilots had learned to use its strengths with ruthless skill. And one of the most important discoveries was that the huge aircraft with its reinforced structure could survive pull-out forces close to 9 GS during recovery from steep dives. And that single fact transformed the nature of pursuit, because German fighters built for speed and agility at low altitudes usually began to break apart when they crossed 7 GS during recovery from high-speed dives, and many pilots saw their wings fold cleanly under the pressure, while the American pilots pulled through the same maneuvers without fear. And this turned what German pilots once considered their escape technique into a deadly trap, because if they dove hard, the P-47 would fall, and if they tried to pull out, the stress would destroy them. Colonel Hubert Zemck, commanding the 56th Fighter Group, saw these strengths more clearly than most, and he reshaped the entire method of escort fighting. And he told his men to abandon the fine-turning maneuvers used by Spitfire pilots, and to embrace the true nature of the Thunderbolt. And he taught them that altitude was their shield, speed was their sword, and firepower was their finishing blow. And he created a new style of conflict known as boom and zoom, in which American fighters operated at 30,000 feet, then dove with crushing speed, fired a short burst from 8 guns. They climbed back into the thin air where the German engines gasped and could not follow. And he told his pilots to ignore German attempts to lure them down into low-altitude turning fights, because the P-47 ruled the air above 20,000 feet, and the Luftwaffe no longer controlled the terms of battle. The results were staggering, as the 56th Fighter Group, flying only P-47s, became the most successful American fighter group in Europe, with 674 confirmed aerial victories and only 100 aircraft lost in air-to-air combat, giving them a ratio of 5-to-1. And many individual pilots rose to frightening levels of success, as Francis Gabreski reached 28 victories, Robert Johnson 27, Hubert Zemck 17.75, and Fred Christensen 21.5, and each score was confirmed by gun camera footage and wreckage found on the ground, leaving no doubt about the destructive power of the Thunderbolt. The German response was to modify their fighters, and they created the Bf-109G series with a larger engine and a methanol water injection system to boost temporary power, but the improvement mattered only below 20,000 feet, and at higher altitudes the P-47 still dominated completely, and they also tried to build the high-altitude TA-152, with a massive engine and long wings. But they managed to produce only 43 units before their factories began to collapse under the weight of American bombing, and they rushed their new jet fighter, the Me-262, into service, but the jet needed steady fuel and careful maintenance, and Germany no longer had the resources to support large numbers of advanced aircraft, so the Luftwaffe fielded at most 50 jets at one time, while the Americans deployed thousands of Thunderbolts every month. The pressure continued to build on German ace pilots like Gunther Ahr, who had scored 275 victories and who fought the P-47 repeatedly in the year 1944. And even he admitted that above 6,000 meters the Americans ruled the sky completely because their engines produced more power, their ammunition lasted longer, and their aircraft could take damage that would destroy German fighters 3 times over. And he said that no matter how many P-47s they shot down, more always appeared because the Americans built them faster than Germany could destroy them. Production numbers told the truth clearly, as Republic Aviation eventually built 15,677 P-47s, while the Evansville plant in Indiana constructed 6,347 more, and workers there, many of them women with no prior experience, built 27 fighters per day by 1944, and each aircraft required 25,000 hours of labor, 65,000 separate parts, 7 miles of wiring, and 850 pounds of armor plating, and the main wing spar was a solid bar of aluminum weighing 300 pounds, strong enough to survive 20 G-forces, and German fighters used hollow spars to save weight. But those spars failed when stressed at high speeds, and that difference in strength explained why German wings snapped while Thunderbolts endured. The turbo supercharger system was another engineering triumph, as the turbine wheel was built from special nickel-chromium alloy that survived temperatures near 1,600 degrees Fahrenheit, and each wheel had blades machined with microscopic precision, and General Electric produced 2,000 of them each month, while German engineers struggled to build even 20 of similar quality. In February of 1944, Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring visited JG2 in France and inspected their newly delivered Bf-109 G6 fighters and asked the wing commander what he needed to defeat the Americans, and the officer said without hesitation that he needed P-47s. And Göring turned purple with anger and sent the officer to the Eastern Front, but every pilot in the unit knew he had spoken the truth, and by this point the P-47 had flown hundreds of thousands of sorties and had dropped 132,000 tons of bombs and had fired 135 million rounds of 50 caliber ammunition and had destroyed thousands of trains, vehicles, and aircraft. The Luftwaffe, reeling under the combined force of American engineering, altitude superiority, industrial output, and unbreakable design, and the German pilots who once laughed at the 7-ton milk bottle, now found it ruling the sky with power they could neither match nor escape. The deeper the war pushed into 1944, the more undeniable the dominance of the P-47 became, and the Luftwaffe officers who had once mocked the heavy American fighter were now facing the brutal mathematics of industrial warfare that shaped every battle in the sky and on ground. Because the Thunderbolt did not merely excel in aerial combat, it became one of the most feared ground attack machines in Europe, and its combat record grew into something no German pilot or commander had imagined possible when they first saw the chunky 7-ton machine and dismissed it as an American mistake. By the time spring arrived, the P-47 had flown more than 423,000 sorties across the European theatre and had dropped 132,000 tons of bombs, in addition to firing 135 million rounds from its 850 caliber guns, and the destruction it inflicted on German infrastructure was staggering, with more than 11,800 aircraft destroyed on the ground or in the air, more than 9,000 locomotives smashed, more than 86,000 railway cars crippled, and more than 6,000 armored vehicles burned or overturned under relentless attacks. Yet despite these achievements, only 3,600 P-47s were lost to all causes, and fewer than 900 of these losses came from air-to-air combat, and the rest were from flak mechanical issues or accidents, which meant that for every P-47 destroyed in the air, 14 German aircraft were eliminated, and the United States replaced each lost Thunderbolt with 15 new ones, while Germany struggled to build even a few hundred fighters each month under constant bombing. Lieutenant General Dietrich Peltz, who oversaw Luftwaffe operations in the West, sent a grim report to Hitler in March of 1944, explaining that the Americans, especially the P-47, had seized air superiority not through delicate design, but through industrial weight and strategic reach. Because the Americans could attack from altitudes, the Germans could not reach, could pursue at speeds, the Germans could not match, could survive hits that would shred German machines, and could arrive in numbers so vast that no tactical skill could equalize the imbalance. And he explained that where Germany managed to field 20 fighters, the Americans launched 200, and that this gap would only grow. For the Luftwaffe, the greatest danger was not the aircraft lost, but the men lost because German aces who had fought since the early years were falling to the Thunderbolts one after another. And when Major Klaus Mayet, an ace with 75 victories, was shot down by P-47s in September of 1944, his replacement arrived with only 40 hours of fighter training. And when that pilot was killed 3 weeks later, the next replacement had only 25 hours of flight time and fewer than 10 hours in fighters. And meanwhile, the American pilot training program produced 7,000 new fighter pilots each month by mid-1944, each with 350 hours of training and 50 hours in frontline aircraft and 20,000 rounds of gunnery practice, while German pilots received perhaps 112 total hours and only 200 rounds for gunnery training, which meant the skill gap grew wider every month, and every lost German veteran represented knowledge that would never be passed on. First Lieutenant Arthur Bowers of the 56th Fighter Group found himself in one of these deadly encounters on March 15th in the year 1944, when he shot down his 5th German aircraft and became an ace, and his opponent made the fatal decision to try to outdive a P-47, and Bowers dropped his nose from 28,000 feet, and his airspeed climbed past 550 miles per hour, and though the controls grew heavy, he maintained full authority while the German pilot pulled out too hard at 3,000 feet, and his wings folded cleanly, stress leaving nothing but a tumbling wreck, and Bowers pulled 7 GS to recover and felt only a shudder from his Thunderbolt. The explanation came from physics, because terminal velocity rises with mass and decreases with drag, and the P-47 weighed nearly twice as much as a Bf-109, and though it had thicker wings and a massive cowling that produced drag, the sheer weight overcame that resistance, and in a vertical dive from 30,000 feet, a P-47 could approach the speed of sound, reaching as much as 650 miles per hour in testing. And at those speeds, ordinary control surfaces became stiff and near useless, and pilots needed boosted controls, which German designers had dismissed as unnecessary complexity because they had never imagined fighters diving so fast. Republic test pilots like Lowry Brabham had taken the Thunderbolt through these terrifying tests, diving from 40,000 feet into zones where compressibility effects locked the controls and made the aircraft buffet violently, and he survived these experiences because the P-47 structure held together in conditions no European fighter had survived, and the lessons gained from those tests went into every production model with strengthened tails, reinforced linkages, and dive recovery flaps that let pilots maintain control even near the edge of the speed of sound. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe felt the pressure rise as JG-300, led by Major Walter Doll, struggled in the increasingly deadly skies of 1944, because his unit was supposed to attack bombers, but the P-47 escorts had become the real threat because they waited at 30,000 feet where German engines faltered, and once the German formations committed to attacking the bombers, the Thunderbolts dropped on them with the weight of falling hammers, and Dahl admitted that his pilots feared the escorts more than the bomber guns because the escorts arrived with such speed and power that survival depended more on luck than skill. By summer, the P-47 controls the high sky like a kingdom, and German pilots found themselves unable to climb to meet the Thunderbolts, unable to turn with them at altitude, unable to keep pace in dives, and unable to match their firepower. and above all unable to endure the endless supply of reinforcements and replacement aircraft the United States delivered to the front lines. The Luftwaffe staggering under losses of pilots' machines, training facilities and fuel, while the P-47 continues to grow stronger in numbers, reach and tactical value, and the German belief that they could still dictate the shape of the air war fades into despair as the heavy American fighter they once laughed at becomes the unstoppable force that breaks their last hopes of regaining control of the European sky. By the middle of 1944, the German pilots learned to fear the escorts more than the bombers because the bombers at least flew predictable routes, and their defensive guns followed patterns that experienced pilots could study and avoid, but the P-47 escorts were something else entirely, for they waited at 30,000 feet like predators circling above a battlefield, and once any Luftwaffe formation committed to an attack, the Thunderbolts fell on them with crushing force and speed, and Major Walter Dahl, who commanded JG-300, admitted that the escorts felt like death itself arriving from the sun because his pilots could not climb high enough to meet them, and could not dive fast enough to escape them, and the bombers almost seemed harmless compared to the P-47 groups that patrolled the upper sky. Colonel David Schilling, who took command of the 56th Fighter Group after Colonel Zemk, pushed the performance of the Thunderbolt even further, and he encouraged his pilots to experiment with new methods that turned the P-47 into a weapon of extraordinary reach and flexibility, and he introduced the use of 150-gallon drop tanks, which extended the fighter's range and allowed P-47s to sweep into the heart of Germany, including Berlin, and return safely, and his group tested paddle blade propellers that increased the climb rate by nearly 800 feet per minute, and water injection systems that boosted emergency power to as high as 2,800 horsepower, and each improvement made the heavy fighter faster, stronger, and more dangerous than before. The Germans watched these changes with growing despair because each month the American fighters displayed new capabilities, and each month more Thunderbolts entered service while German production slowed under bombing shortages and lack of fuel, and the technicians of the Luftwaffe estimated that American fighters improved their performance by about 3% every month through constant refinement, while German fighters remained nearly unchanged because resources and time no longer existed. In September of 1944, during Operation Market Garden, the P-47 proved once again that it was far more than an escort when it unleashed devastating ground attack missions supporting Allied forces, and German troops began calling the Thunderbolt the Hellhound because of its terrifying effectiveness, and each P-47 could carry 2,000 pounds of bombs plus rockets plus 8 guns, and they flew cab rank missions circling the battlefield while ground forces called targets to them by radio, and Under-Officer Otto Stamberger of the 12th SS Panzer Division remembered that the Thunderbolts came in so low that German soldiers could see the faces of the American pilots before the guns roared, and he said that 8 guns firing together shredded trees and armor alike, and that even hiding vehicles under forest cover offered no protection because the P-47 simply blasted the trees apart or dropped flares at night to expose anything trying to move in darkness, and for German troops there was no hope of escaping the Thunderbolt once it chose a target. The mathematics of ground attack were as overwhelming as those in the air because the P-47 fired 135 million rounds of 50 caliber ammunition on ground targets, launched 60,000 rockets, and dropped 60,000 tons of bombs, and while German fighters pressed into ground attack Rolls-lost aircraft at high rates, the P-47, with its armor and strength, could survive flak hits that would tear an FW-190 into pieces. The Thunderbolt grew into an icon of destruction that supported infantry tanks and paratroopers, and its presence changed battles by pinning down German units, destroying supply lines and hunting troop movements day and night, and each attack chipped away at the shrinking strength of the German army. In November of 1944, Lieutenant Colonel John C. Mayer achieved something remarkable when he took off in his P-47, named Lambie, and shot down 3 Bf-109s during morning comm. Then landed refueled and took off again to shoot down a 4th in the afternoon, and he explained later that he never tried to fight the Germans in tight turns at low altitudes, but simply used altitude, speed, and firepower to strike where he held the advantage, and his confidence came from knowing that above 20,000 feet, few enemies could challenge his machine. The Luftwaffe made one last attempt to counter the P-47 with the high-altitude fighter known as the TA-152, designed by Kurt Tank, and it carried a huge Jumo 213 engine and a pressurized cockpit that allowed operations at heights where the P-47 excelled, but only 43 were ever built, and they required special fuel that Germany could not produce anymore, and they needed careful maintenance at a time when trained technicians were scarce and airfields were constantly under attack. While Germany attempted to produce a handful of these advanced fighters, the United States created the P-47 and the ultimate Thunderbolt variant with longer wings, increased fuel capacity reaching more than 2,200 gallons, and an upgraded engine producing 2,800 horsepower, making the aircraft able to escort B-29s all the way to Japan and return, and more than 1,800 of this variant were built, which was greater than the total number of German fighters produced during 1945. After the war, General Adolf Galland admitted openly that the Luftwaffe had made a grave mistake by laughing at the Thunderbolt when it first appeared, because he said that its size and weight, which they once mocked, had become its strengths, and the lack of cannon, which they ridiculed, was irrelevant because the 8 guns were devastating, and he said the Americans were not building a mere fighter but a complete weapons system designed for high-altitude combat and industrial mass production. And by the time Germany understood this truth, it was already too late, and the Luftwaffe collapsing on all fronts, while the P-47 grows into the unstoppable symbol of American air power, built in such numbers and refined with such consistency that no German design or tactic could reverse the outcome that now swept across the skies of Europe like an unstoppable tide. As the war entered its final year, the P-47 stood as a force the Luftwaffe could neither match nor escape, and every German pilot who had once laughed at the heavy American fighter now understood that their early mockery had blinded them from seeing the real threat rising across the Atlantic, because they had mistaken size for clumsiness and weight for weakness. And in doing so, they failed to grasp that the Thunderbolt was built to fight in a kind of war Germany could no longer sustain. The raw numbers revealed a truth more devastating than any individual dogfight, because 15,677 P-47s were built, of which only 3,499 were lost to all causes, and this meant that despite flying 423,000 combat sorties, the Thunderbolt suffered a loss rate of only 22%. And during those same years, the Luftwaffe lost more than 45,000 aircraft across all fronts. And in the Western Theater alone, where the P-47 operated, the Luftwaffe lost 23,000 aircraft, and the mathematics suggested that Thunderbolt groups were directly or indirectly responsible for nearly half of those losses. Individual American units achieved astonishing results, as the 56th Fighter Group destroyed 1,006 aerial targets, while the 353rd Fighter Group claimed 647, and the 78th Fighter Group destroyed 750 locomotives, which crippled rail supply lines across Germany. And these successes did not come from elite superhuman pilots, but from ordinary young Americans trained in a powerful system, flying a machine designed for high-altitude dominance and industrial strength survival. One of the most famous P-47 veterans, Captain Robert S. Johnson, who survived the brutal attack from Egon Meyer, ended the war with 27 confirmed victories, all achieved in the Thunderbolt, and he later wrote that the Germans called their jugs flying bathtubs and 7-ton milk bottles, and many laughed at their shape, but when the Americans dropped from 30,000 feet at more than 550 miles per hour with 8 guns blazing, there was no laughter left in the sky. The deeper truth behind the P-47 was that it embodied the mathematics of industrial warfare, because Germany built aircraft by hand in modest workshops, while America produced them in vast mechanized plants that never stopped running, and the Luftwaffe trained pilots through traditional slow methods, while America built a training pipeline that moved thousands of men through flight schools every month with standardized lessons, advanced ranges and mountains of ammunition and fuel for practice. Oberleutnant Heinz Bahr, one of Germany's greatest aces with 220 victories, acknowledged this bitterly after the war, and he said that although individual German fighters might be more maneuverable in certain situations or more elegant in design, the P-47 was good enough at everything and superior in the things that truly mattered. And he said the Thunderbolt dominated high-altitude combat, had unmatched dive speed, absorbed damage like a tank, carried enormous firepower, and above all existed in numbers too large to fight. The scale of American industry was something German planners never understood, because Republic Aviation's Farmingdale plant alone covered 67 acres under a single roof, and inside that space 7 assembly lines constructed Thunderbolts simultaneously, and to the east the Pratt & Whitney engine plant in Connecticut employed 40,000 workers and ran without pause day and night, while the supercharger factory in Massachusetts produced 100 units every day using 16 different alloys that Germany could barely produce in small laboratory samples. Meanwhile, the American training system expanded relentlessly, with Luke Field in Arizona preparing 500 P-47 pilots every month, and similar programs operating in Florida and across several states, and by 1944, a newly arrived American pilot in Europe often possessed more total flying hours than many Luftwaffe instructors, and each had fired more training ammunition than German pilots would fire in combat across their entire careers. Logistics sealed Germany's fate because American ships carried as many as 100 Thunderbolts each week to British ports, where they were assembled in 3 days, and many were flying combat missions by the end of that same week, and spare engines filled warehouses and replacement wings, and fuselages waited on racks, and ammunition ships delivered millions of 50 caliber rounds with such regularity that ground crews sometimes measured them in tons, not belts. Major Johann Steinhoff, who commanded JG-77 in Italy, witnessed this overwhelming supply chain firsthand, and he wrote later that his unit sometimes had only 12 serviceable fighters on its best days, while the Americans launched 75 P-47s from a single airfield, and he said that German pilots hoarded every cannon shell, while Americans fired their ammunition without hesitation, because they knew an endless supply waited behind them. He said that the Luftwaffe repaired battle damage with scavenged parts, while the Americans often replaced entire aircraft overnight, and he realized that by 1944, aerial combat was no longer a contest of individual skill, but a collision between two industrial systems, and Germany's system was collapsing. The German pilots, seeing the truth that the P-47 was not just a fighter, but the spear tip of a vast industrial machine, and by the time they understood this, the outcome of the war in the air had already been decided, and the Thunderbolt stood unchallenged as the symbol of American power, high above the broken skies of Europe. By the final winter of the war, the contest in the air was no longer a battle between pilots, but a battle between entire national systems, and the Luftwaffe, which had once ruled the European sky, now survived only on paper because the P-47 had shattered not only German formations, but the very structure of German air power, and the Thunderbolt had destroyed aircraft factories, fuel depots, training schools, transport hubs, and the fragile network of knowledge that kept the Luftwaffe alive. And every time the P-47 swept across a German airfield, a veteran instructor or skilled mechanic might be lost, and each loss erased years of experience that Germany had no way to replace. By January of 1945, the Luftwaffe had perhaps 1,000 operational fighters across all fronts, but they faced more than 10,000 Allied fighters in Western Europe alone, and more than 3,000 of these were P-47s, and the same pilots who had mocked the Thunderbolt as a fat American milk bottle 2 years earlier now found themselves fighting a sky filled with its engine roar from horizon to horizon. The joke had become the last bitter note in the collapse of German air power. The final insult to the Luftwaffe came on New Year's Day, 1945, during Operation Bodenplatte, which had been planned as a decisive German strike to destroy Allied air power on the ground, and 800 German fighters rose to attack, and for a brief hour the Luftwaffe believed it might reclaim the skies, but the P-47s were already airborne and waiting, and they fell from above in the same deadly fashion that had become their trademark. And before the smoke cleared, the Germans had lost 270 aircraft and 170 experienced pilots, while the P-47 groups lost only 23 aircraft, and most of those were destroyed on the ground, and the Americans replaced them within 48 hours. German ace Gunther R., who survived the war, said in an interview decades later that people always asked him which fighter was the best, and he would list the Spitfire as beautiful, but short-range the Mustang as excellent but delicate, the FW-190 as a superb machine, but too few in number, and then he would speak of the P-47, which the Germans had mocked and underrated. And he said it killed their best pilots, destroyed their vehicles, wrecked their trains, and bombed their airfields. And he said the Thunderbolt did everything, survived everything, and existed in such a flood that German pilots felt it was always there no matter how many they shot down. The story of the P-47 revealed a truth that many nations still forget, that technical elegance means little without the weight of industry behind it, and that tactical skill cannot defeat strategic abundance, because while the Luftwaffe built agile fighters in small numbers and trained pilots with old methods, the United States built an air force out of factories that worked every hour of every day, and trained new pilots in schools that consumed fuel, ammunition, and engines in quantities Germany could not imagine. German pilots who laughed at the 7-ton fighter in 1943 were riding supply trucks pulled by horses by 1945, and their beautiful fighters sat grounded for lack of fuel while above them the sky thundered with the sound of double Wasp engines as P-47s flew mission after mission. When nations in later years marvel at sleek, advanced weapons systems, they forget the lesson written across Europe by the P-47, that the system that wins is not always the most graceful or the most refined, but the one that can be built in huge numbers, maintained with simple tools, and operated by well-trained crews who never run short of replacements. The Thunderbolt embodied all of these qualities, and it was built in factories where workers who had never touched aircraft before assembled wings, fuselages and superchargers in a rhythm that moved like a living machine, and the result was an aircraft that stormed across European skies at speeds near 500 miles per hour, carrying 8 guns that rarely ran dry and flown by pilots who arrived faster than Germany could replace its losses. By the summer of 1944, the Germans had stopped laughing at the P-47 because the roar of its Pratt & Whitney engine had become the soundtrack of the Luftwaffe's destruction, and what had once been mocked as too fat to fly had crushed the German Air Force beneath the weight of American industrial might. In the end, the destruction brought by the Thunderbolt was not a matter of chance or luck, but a mathematical certainty measured in tons of aluminum miles of wiring, millions of rounds of ammunition, and thousands of trained pilots who carried the heavy fighter into battle day after day. The P-47 destroyed more enemy aircraft in the European theater than any other American fighter, dropped more bombs than many medium bombers, and survived battle damage that would have destroyed any other aircraft twice over. And it flew more than 423,000 sorties, bringing home the majority of the men who trusted their lives to its strength. The Germans had laughed at its shape, mocked its weight, and dismissed its design, and they paid for that misunderstanding with the collapse of their air force. The Thunderbolt was not graceful, and it was not beautiful, but it was victorious, and in war, that is the only mathematics that matters, and the truth that the P-47 was not simply a fighter, but the living proof that industrial power, when forged into steel and unleashed into the sky, can break even the most skilled and determined opponent and reshape the fate of nations. If you want more forgotten war stories told with truth, grit, and no filters, subscribe now. Your support keeps these missions alive.